Hey, what's up, guys? This is Rich from Phoenix Furniture Restorations, and I hope everybody's doing well and had a really nice holiday. Right now, I'm in the shop and I'm working on this little crotch mahogany coffee table that I picked up on Facebook Marketplace for $75. And it is in kind of rough condition. There's finish that's flaking off all over the place, as well as a bunch of trim that's either missing or falling off completely. So I'm going to have to improvise a little bit just to figure out how to fix that. And the solid mahogany trim work on the top, pretty much the same thing. It's completely falling apart with a couple areas that are still intact, and this one little piece right here actually split. So I'm going to have to glue that up and repair that. But there were a couple areas where the trim work was still intact, where the glue hadn't failed. So I'm going to end up having to remove it and glue it back down. Now here's a really good shot of the finish that's just completely flaking off, and this is actually a good thing because it's going to make it a lot easier to remove versus a finish that is still intact and you got to really either use a lot of muscle or use a chemical stripper, which I'm not opposed to, but it's always better when I don't have to use chemicals. Now, two parts of this piece that I actually thought were pretty cool was that there's an inlay right here along the side of the piece, and there are these really cool claw feet that I've only really seen a couple of times, like maybe 5 or 6 times, and I don't know, I just think it's a cool touch. And there is one drawer on this piece, and it's actually not in horrible condition. It definitely needs a good cleaning up, but it's lined with a really nice mahogany veneer, and there are no dovetails on the drawer, but that's not always a deal breaker. It is still constructed pretty well. And there's also a brass pull on both sides of the piece, actually. There's the drawer on the front side, and you have a faux drawer on the back side. So why save this piece? Is it really worth saving? It's just a crappy old coffee table. And my answer is usually always yes. And hopefully by the end of the video, I will show you why. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this transformation. So just like any other furniture project, I'm going to begin by cleaning this piece head to toe. And to do that, I'm going to be using some Dawn dish soap, obviously diluted in some water. And I'm using Dawn dish soap because it's a little bit more of a safer alternative than the degreasers that I usually use. Not that I'm opposed to degreasers or anything like that. You guys see me use them all the time. But sometimes I just like to use something that's a little bit more of a safer option. And this stuff is actually really great at cutting through grime and oils and grease and dirt. It's really a very effective alternative to regular degreasers. And I'm going to be cleaning this entire piece completely head to toe. And that includes the undersides too, which I know you can't even really see, but when I clean my pieces, I like to make sure that I'm cleaning every aspect of it. Now, there wasn't a lot of visible dirt on this piece. Like on the towel, you can't really see a lot of dirt coming off. But there was a lot of grease and oil residue that was on here. And it's really important that you remove any oils or grease because anything that remains, number one, your stripper won't work effectively or as effectively as it normally would. And two, it's most likely going to gum up your sandpaper very fast. And also, you have the risk of grinding all of that stuff down into the wood grain, which you really don't want to do. Now here I'm just removing the hardware, and this hardware is solid brass and it is very heavy, but it is heavily tarnished, so I'm definitely looking forward to seeing how this polishes up a little bit later on. Now some of the trim work came off already by itself, but there was some trim work that was still adhered to the piece. So I'm just taking a mallet and very gently, I know it looks like I'm hitting it really hard, but I'm just very gently hitting it with the mallet and slowly loosening it up more and more until eventually it came right off. And it's a similar situation with this piece of trim right here, except this piece was broken in half, so I'm just gently coaxing it off with a putty knife and a hammer, just so I don't break it even further. And a little bit did splinter off a little bit, but it was really negligible compared to the entire piece. Alright, now it's time to start scraping. And I'm using my carbide scraper. And I'm using a carbide scraper because this finish was already kind of failing, and I thought that using a chemical stripper would kind of be an overkill. And I just really honestly like scraping, especially the fact that this finish is already kind of failing. It just makes it a lot easier to scrape. And of course, I'm being very delicate on the edges because that's a very easy area to damage the veneer. And as you can see in this shot right here, there's actually 4 different sections of veneer that make up the top. So while I'm scraping, I got to be really careful because I don't want to accidentally catch one of those seams of veneer and tear it. But I've been doing this for a couple of years now, and I'm pretty used to the feeling of when you're about to tear a piece of veneer, especially going over different seams of veneer. It's really easy to tear it off, and it's kind of like a muscle memory kind of a thing. You can kind of feel when that's about to happen. So I'm just taking my time, going very gently, and eventually I got all of the finish off with no problems. And this is a little bit of a funny part because I flipped this table over and I was about to start working on removing the legs, and all of a sudden,
what the f? Oh my god. Alright. Oh my goodness.
now this isn't really a big deal. It's easily fixable, and I think I was just having a bad day that day. One of those days where everything just seems to go wrong. But what I think happened was that leg was previously repaired, so I think that the glue joint just kind of failed and it just ended up falling off. But you have to admit the timing of that was kind of funny. But anyway, what I'm doing here is I'm unscrewing everything that I can to try to take these legs off. But what I found out was that all the leg assembly was completely glued together, not using hide glue, using regular PVA glue. So unfortunately, I cannot take the legs off, but I can take the top off because the top was just screwed on. But a couple of the screws were stripped. So I'm just using my fine tool here and I'm just cutting through a couple of those screws to allow the top to separate from the bottom. Now that I got the top separated, I'm going to take the top and I'm going to begin sanding it down. Now I'm only using a 220 grit here. I'm not starting with like 150 or 180 and then climbing up. I'm just starting with a 220 and I'm going to be finishing with a 220. And that's because I already took off basically 90% of the finish. There's only a little tiny bit of finish remaining, but I could sand right through that. So because the finish is basically all gone, I'm not trying to take off much material here. I'm just trying to smooth everything out and get it prepared for the finish. Now, in between those two sheets of veneer is a piece of solid wood, probably like poplar or birch or something like that. And they have used, it's either a paint or a very, very dark tinted lacquer that they used here to cover up the exposed sides of the wood. So I'm just taking my carbide scraper here, it's just my regular carbide scraper, and I'm just scraping off that tinted lacquer or paint or whatever it is. And after I got it all scraped off, I'm going to come in with a 180 grit. And I'm using 180 instead of 220 because I want my stain to appear a lot darker. And sanding to 180 is going to help me achieve that look. Because the lower you sand, the darker a stain will end up appearing. And the higher you sand, the lighter a stain will end up looking. So because I want this stain to be more on the dark side, I'm just sanding a little bit lower to 180. I'm going to flip it over, and I'm actually going to sand down the underside also. Now, this is something that I really don't have to do. It's not something that's really going to be noticeable unless you decide to look underneath the table for some reason. But this is a coffee table, and there are going to be people drinking on this table, and there are definitely going to be some spills. So if anything spills and ends up running underneath the table, I want to make sure that it is completely sealed, and sanding is a necessary step. Now, since these legs are very decorative and have a lot of high and low spots, I'm going to be using a chemical stripper, as you can see right here. I really would have liked to have scraped these legs, but it would have been completely impossible because there are just way too many decorative aspects to these legs. So all I did was I applied the stripper, I let it sit for about maybe 5 minutes, and I'm coming in with a stiff nylon brush, and I'm just going to scrub all that finish and disturb it so I can wipe it away. You can also use steel wool for the same purpose. Steel wool is actually very effective at disturbing the finish and making it very easy just to wipe up, but I like to use a stiff nylon brush. It's just a personal preference. Next, I'm going to basically soak a shop towel in some acetone, and I'm going to get as much of the finish off as I can. And I'm using acetone here because acetone basically kind of melts or dissolves the finish that's left over. It doesn't do it with every single finish, but most of the finishes that I've tried, it does work. And it just makes cleaning up finish so easy. You do want to be careful with acetone though, because it can dissolve certain glues, so you definitely want to be careful around glue joints and certain areas like that. Now, since there are just so many nooks and crannies on this leg, I'm going to actually be using a Q-tip soaked in acetone, and hopefully this is going to help me get into all those really tiny areas that I just could not reach with anything else. And you can just see how gross finish looks after you removed it. It's almost black, which was all the coloring that was added to the piece when it was finished. And you might be asking, why am I showing so many shots of me using this Q-tip? And that's because this took me about almost 45 minutes each leg, because there was a lot of little areas I needed to get into. And it probably took me about 2.5, 3 hours to get this whole thing done. You really do need the patience of a saint sometimes when you're refinishing furniture, because it really does take a while before all the pieces start to come together and things actually feel like they're moving forwards. And one tip I can give you is try not to rush, because when you rush, that's when you typically tend to make mistakes. And in my experience, at least, my work doesn't really come out as good when I rush or when I try to move faster than I'm really supposed to be moving. It might be a little agonizing at times, but it's definitely worth taking the time and just moving at a nice, slow, steady pace. But anyway, back to the piece. Right now, I am sanding down the drawer box. There is one drawer on this piece, and I'm going to be sanding it completely inside and out, top to bottom, starting with this really nice mahogany drawer bottom. And it's always a plus for me when I find pieces that have mahogany drawer bottoms, because it's just such a nice kind of upscale feel and quality, and it just makes the piece feel a lot more high quality to me. It's just a really nice touch, and I really like it. Now, as I'm sanding down this drawer box, I'm not sure what exactly I want to do with this drawer face, because I'm not really crazy about the kind of fluted look to it. There's also a bunch of little pieces of veneer that are missing off the fluted front. And aside from not even liking the way that it looks to begin with, I am not really crazy about taking the time to try to fix it. So I got to figure out another plan for that. And sanding down these drawer boxes takes quite a while, so I have a little bit of time to figure out what I want to do. And here you can see what I was talking about with the drawer face over here with these kind of fluted details. I'm not really a big fan of the way that this looks, and plus there was a couple pieces that were missing, and I'm just not going to take the time to try to restore that. So I'm just going to be removing everything, and right here I'm just removing this little beaded trim on the bottom. I'm just using a chisel and I'm very gently hammering it off, trying not to gouge the wood underneath. I then began to chisel away at the fluted area on the drawer face, but then after getting a little bit of the way through, I decided to go a little bit of a different route. I'm actually going to be using an 80 grit on my surf prep, and I'm just going to sand it down until it's flush. Just getting the last little bit of the beaded trim off here, and you could see that that's what's happening now. I'm coming in with an 80 grit, and I'm just going to sand this down until I get about, I would say maybe a 32nd of an inch. Basically, until the ridges are no longer there. And after about maybe 10 minutes or so, I got through that fluted section and I have a nice flat area now. I noticed that on the side of the drawer face, there was a little area where the glue had failed and the wood was starting to lift. So I just took a screwdriver just to open up the area a little bit, and I'm just pushing some glue down into that crack. You can also use a glue syringe for the same purpose, but sometimes finger is just a little bit of a faster option, and it's also very effective. So that's just what I'm doing for this particular situation. After I got enough glue into that crack, I'm just wiping up the excess glue, and I'm just going to clamp it up. And if you want to know if you have enough glue in a particular joint, just squeeze the joint, and if you get a glue squeeze out, you know that you have just enough glue in there. Now I'm just using a foam interface pad on my surf prep here to begin sanding down the frame of the table. I'm going to be hand sanding the rest of the frame of the piece, but I just wanted to show you that using this foam pad from Surf Prep is a very, very effective option, especially if you're trying to save some time. It's a very, very effective time saver. And I have nothing but time, so I'm just hand sanding the rest of this section, which if you remove the finish first, it really isn't that hard. I just prefer to hand sand most of the time. And for the rest of the inner guts of this piece, I'm just going to be using my Surf Prep again. And I believe I'm using a 180 here. I think I used a 180 on basically all of the trim work and the inner workings of the frame of the piece. And I used 220 for all the veneered sections. And again, I'm using 180 on the rest of the trim work and the insides of this piece because I'm going to be staining pretty much everything you see here. And I want that stain to be very dark looking. So 180 is going to help me achieve that look. And this really isn't something I have to do. Again, this is just something I really like to do. I like to try to get into every single part of the piece that I can and give it a really good refresh. You know, it's not something that everybody does, but it's kind of a standard for me. I like to really make sure that I'm refinishing this piece completely inside and out. Now, all of that fluted detail and the beaded trim that was on the drawer face is also on each side of the entire piece. And because I'm not really that crazy about it, and because I already removed it from the drawer face, I'm going to be removing it from each side as well, just to make everything nice and uniform. So I'm using that same 80 grit, and I'm just blasting through all of that fluted detail and getting down to some nice solid wood. And because this piece is almost entirely mahogany, I'm thinking about maybe putting some really nice mahogany veneer on all of these sections that I'm sanding down, but running in a different direction, and maybe even staining it darker. So I'll have a little bit of contrast with the direction of the wood grain and also color. And it sounds really nice in my head right now, but I don't know, I'm hoping that it turns out nice in the end. But we'll see what happens. When I first got this piece, I actually did go looking to find some replacement for this beaded trim here. And I went to a bunch of different stores, and not one of them had eighth of an inch, or I'm sorry, quarter of an inch beading that I would have needed to replace this. So even if I wanted to replace it, I'm pretty much out of luck. Alright, so now to fix this leg that very abruptly fell off. I'm just taking a chisel here, and I'm scraping off all of the old glue because wood glue isn't going to stick to wood glue. It has to stick to wood fibers. So I'm just getting rid of any leftover wood glue that was on here from the previous repair job. And it's the same thing with the leg itself. I'm just taking off any remaining wood glue and just trying to get some nice fresh wood for this glue up. And alright, that looks good. So first I'm just going to do a dry fit, just to make sure that it fits in place right and there are no little pieces of wood that are in the way. And I'm just going to add my glue. And just one little tip that I've learned, if you're going to dab glue around with your finger, well, you want to make sure that your finger is clean, because sometimes the oils from your finger can actually interfere with the bonding of the glue. So just remember to keep your fingers nice and clean if you're going to do that. All right, and that looks good. So I'm just going to attach the leg and going to try to clamp it up. And I say try because it's on a very weird angle, and sometimes it's hard to get a good grip. And I'm just cleaning up all the excess glue because it could be a little bit of a pain to try to remove it when it's dry. And as I was wiping up the glue, I actually noticed that the drawer guide was split in half. So I'm just going to do the same thing. I'm just going to glue it up and wipe away all the excess glue. And you may have noticed that my hand was a little bit cut up there. That's just because I was using a chisel, and chisels are very sharp. I do have a pair of anti-cut gloves that I could have worn, but I completely forgot. So just be careful if you're going to use chisels. And I let that leg sit for about 4 hours to dry up. And when I came back to check on it, I noticed that it didn't dry actually at all. So I'm just going to move on to plan B here. And I'm going to add a little bit more glue. I'm going to clamp it back up, but this time I'm actually going to add a couple of screws just to hold it in place. I normally don't like to add screws or, do anything aside from gluing up, but sometimes it's necessary. So here I'm just drilling my pilot holes with a countersink bit, just so that the head of the screw doesn't protrude above the wood, and I'm going to add my screws. And I'm just going to add one more screw down here. Okay, so now I'm using that same foam interface pad by Surf Prep, and I'm going to begin sanding down the legs. Well, I'm not going to be able to sand the entire leg with this. I'm only sanding the flat areas that I'm able to reach with this foam pad. So I'll sand what I can with the foam pad, and then I'll come in and hand sand all the rest. And my sander was fighting me a little bit. Now you can see that there's a little bit of finish still on the underside of the legs, but that's no problem. I'm just going to sand through that. And it was being a little bit stubborn, but I got through it. And sanding down these claw feet were a little bit tricky, but I just folded up a piece of sandpaper and I was able to get in pretty much all of the little tiny spots. And I'm just removing this little glide here just so I can clean it up a little bit and also so I can sand the bottom of the feet. And I'm just being really careful removing it because it's very easy to snap those little teeth that anchor into the wood. And I don't show it in this video, but I do put these back on in the end. And now I'm just going to sand down all the decorative bits on this leg. And I don't think I mentioned this, but these legs are actually all solid mahogany, which was a great surprise. So the top actually isn't solid mahogany, it's a mahogany veneer on solid wood as the substrate. And it's crotch mahogany actually, just to be specific. The apron of the table is a mahogany veneer as well. And then we have the solid mahogany legs. And the frame of the piece is, I believe it's birch. Not 100% sure actually what kind of wood it is, but it's some kind of light wood, and I'm going to be staining all of it. And I noticed on the side of the piece where the fluted detail used to be, it was coming up a little bit. So I'm just going to take some regular PVA glue, and I'm just going to do the same thing that I did before. I'm just going to put a nice bead of glue across, and I'm going to work it in with my finger. And I'm going to do this quite a number of times just to make sure that I'm really getting the glue down into that crack, because I don't want this coming up again. And I could have used a glue syringe here again, but it was such a small area and it didn't really warrant me filling up a whole glue syringe and having to clean it out later. I usually like to use a glue syringe when I have bigger glue ups to do. I'm just checking to make sure I have enough glue in there, and I'm getting a nice glue squeeze out, so I think I have just enough. I'm just going to clamp that up and let it dry. Alright, so as I mentioned before, I'm going to be staining all of the light wood. So I'm going to mix up a little stain here. And since I'm using Odie's oil for my finish, I thought it was appropriate to use an Odie's oil pigmented oil stain. And what you saw me adding to the cup there was some Odie's Safer solvent. And to that, I'm going to add a little bit of my pigments, and I'm using Southern Pecan and Terracotta to hopefully make a nice reddish brown color. And I used 3 parts Southern Pecan and 1 part Terracotta to make this stain. And I'm just going to give that a really good mix, and then I'm going to add my oil. And I'm using Odie's Super Duper Everlasting oil to complete this stain. And I used roughly a 1-to-1 ratio between the Safer solvent and the oil. And yeah, this is pretty much what I was looking for, a nice reddish brown. And I got a little carried away with the stirring, and I accidentally spilled a bunch on my hand, but that's what gloves are for, I guess. Too bad I wasn't wearing any. Just removing these clamps, and this glue up went well. It's nice and solid now. Now, to take care of these sides where the fluted details and the beading was, I'm thinking for these sections, I'm going to end up putting a new veneer on, but instead, I'm going to have the veneer running this way instead of running straight down like the veneer on the side of the apron is running. And I think this is going to give a really nice but subtle contrast having the veneer running this way instead of running vertical. But before I can do that, I need to repair this little section down here where the beaded trim used to run. I accidentally gouged a little bit out there. So in order to do that, and in order to make a nice strong substrate for this veneer, I'm going to use some Quickwood, which is a 2-part wood epoxy that you just mash together until it's one solid color, and then you just form it into whatever shape you're trying to make. It's kind of like adult Play-Doh. So I'm just going to take my little sausage that I made here and slowly form it into the shape that I'm trying to make. And I'm going to feather it out so it gets a really good grip onto the wood. If you just kind of stick it on, it may not adhere as well as it would have if you tried to feather it on. And yeah, I'm just going to slowly form it, and I'm just trying to make a rough shape here. I'm not trying to make it exact because you got to remember, I'm going to be sanding this down a little bit later on. So you just want to make the basic shape of whatever you're going for, and you can always adjust it with sanding later. All right, now that that's done, I'm just going to flip this table upright, and I'm going to begin staining the trim. And when I say trim, I just mean the exposed part of the substrate right here that is a different type of wood and needs to be stained in order to match the rest of the piece. Now, I didn't really want a lot of contrast at all, actually, with this stain. I'm just trying to get a really, really close color match and give this top the illusion that it's all one solid piece of wood. You guys know that I really love contrast and the two-toned look. But for this piece, I'm looking for more of a uniform kind of a look, in terms of color at least. Now, I'm not using any tape. I don't really need to use tape. If I get any on the top of the piece or wherever I don't want it, I could just do a light sanding and it'll come right off. Now I'm using a paintbrush here, just so it's a little bit more accurate and I can make more of a fine line and not get any on the top of the piece, but you can also use a Merc or Milan pad, or even a shop towel works. But just because of accuracy reasons, I just decided to use a paintbrush. And just like any other stain, I'm going to let this sit on for about maybe 10 minutes or so, and then I'm going to come in with a shop towel and just wipe the rest or the excess off. Now I'm just going to flip this top over, and I'm going to actually be staining the entire underside. And again, this isn't really necessary, but it's just something I really like to do. When I refinish pieces, I really like to kind of refinish everything. And I'm also staining the frame of the piece, like I said before. Again, totally not necessary, but just something I really like to do. I mean, personally, I think that looks so much better. I know you can't really even see it when the table's assembled, but just knowing that it's there just makes me kind of happy. And I decided last minute to stain the entire drawer box and the mahogany drawer bottom, just to make it one uniform color. I was originally going to leave the mahogany bottom alone and just do a clear coat on it, but I decided that making it all one uniform color was probably a little bit of a better look, in my opinion at least. And to be honest, if I just put a clear coat on the mahogany itself, it probably would have been somewhere around this same color anyway. Maybe a little bit more red, but it still would have been pretty close to the color that I'm staining it. And you can see that the stain doesn't actually obscure the grain at all. It actually enhances it, which is exactly what I was looking for. All right, now to sand down the quickwood that's finally dry. I believe I'm using a 150 grit here just to sand down this quickwood. And I'm not trying to sand too aggressively, I'm just trying to sand enough so that it's flush with the wood. And I had to do this for each side and on the drawer face because I unfortunately gouged a little bit of wood out with the chisel when I was taking off that beaded trim. I am pretty good with a chisel, but I'm still learning, so I do make mistakes every now and then. Maybe more often than not. Alright, now that I have that all sanded down, I'm just going to take some measurements here because I'm going to cut out my new piece of veneer that I'm going to be putting on this. And I was actually really surprised. I had one more roll of mahogany veneer. I thought I totally went through it all, but nope, I still have some. So that was a nice surprise. After taking my measurements and tracing out what I need to cut out, I'm just using a razor blade, and I'm very delicately cutting this out. Cutting veneer isn't exactly like cutting cardboard or something like that. It's very unique and very different. Depending on which way you're cutting, if you're cutting against the grain or with the grain or on a diagonal, it's all very different. So you just have to get a feel for it. And I would suggest cutting in multiple shallow cuts rather than just cutting straight through the veneer. And here I'm applying some heat lock glue, and I'm applying it to both surfaces, the veneer and the substrate. And after applying it to both surfaces, I'm going to let it both completely dry. And you can see here, it's completely dry to the touch, and this is important. Next, you want to position the veneer in the way that you want it. And I usually use like a cloth or something as like a barrier between the wood and the iron. And the next step is going to be the iron. Now, as soon as you apply the heat from the iron onto the veneer, it's going to reactivate that dried glue, and it's going to get a very, very strong bond. And I'm just rocking the iron back and forth. I'm not staying in one spot too long because I don't want to burn the veneer, but I'm just moving at a nice, steady, slow pace. And I actually like this method better than using something like contact cement, because with contact cement, it's pretty much just a one-shot deal. Like if you position the veneer wrong or something like that, you really can't peel it back up. But with this, you can take your time and position it, and when you finally have it in the position that you want, you could just take the iron and just adhere it. And that's it. Easy. And after I finished adhering all of the veneer, I just took a razor blade and just trimmed off all the excess. And it's always good to have a little bit more veneer than not enough, obviously. So when you're cutting out your veneer, just make it like maybe 1/8 of an inch. Doesn't have to be a lot, but about maybe 1/8 of an inch overlay on each side. Just giving my new veneer a little 220 grit sanding. And I'm going to do that for the sides as well, the edges. I'm just going to sand it down so it's nice and rounded off. So I kind of went back and forth, kind of trying to think of what finish I wanted to use for this piece. And since this piece is solid mahogany, I kind of wanted to go with a nice natural finish. And of course, I decided to go with Odie's oil. Odie's oil is a tung oil-based hard wax oil finish, and it's probably one of my favorite finishes to use, other than lacquer. And it's completely non-toxic and food safe, which is why I'm able to put this on without any gloves. Plus, it just smells amazing. And I'm putting this on with a 1500 grit Merkur Milan pad, which is just a non-woven abrasive pad. And you can also use a white pad as well. I would definitely not recommend using something like steel wool or a rag to put this stuff on, because you're most likely going to waste a lot of the oil during the application, and it's also not going to be really worked down into the wood grain like it really should be. After letting the Odie's oil sit on this top for about an hour and a half, I came in and buffed it all off. After the top was all good, I flipped it around and I sealed the underside as well. One drawback of using Odie's oil, especially on legs like these, is that there are so many decorative aspects to this leg that it's kind of a big pain in the butt to apply and to buff off the Odie's oil. I could have definitely taken the easy route and just used some lacquer on this piece, but I really wanted to use Odie's oil just because it really brings out the depth and the beauty of the wood, especially because this wood is solid mahogany. And I really just wanted this piece to have a nice natural wood finish and feel. Now, because this leg is so decorative, there were spots that I just could not fit the Mercury Milan pad into. So to get at those little tiny spots, I'm just using a Q-tip with some Odie's oil, and that worked perfectly. And in this shot right here, you can see the drastic color difference that the Odie's oil, well, it doesn't give to the wood, but brings out in the wood. And this is just the natural color of mahogany. It's a very, very dark reddish brown. I'm also sealing the inside of the frame. I sealed basically every single square inch of this piece because just in case there are any spills or anything and liquid runs underneath the table for whatever reason, everything is sealed and protected. And I'm using some Odie's Super Duper Everlasting Oil to seal up this drawer. And Odie's Super Duper Everlasting Oil is very similar to the Universal Oil, which is what I used for the rest of the piece. But it differs in that it's a little bit thinner in consistency, making it a little bit easier to apply and to take off. And I'm sealing this entire drawer box, even the underside, which I don't have to do, of course, but you guys know me by now, so. Alright, so to take care of this hardware now, I'm just using some Brasso, and I'm going to be covering every square inch of the hardware and let it sit in a cup for maybe about 10-15 minutes while it does its magic. And you'll know it's working because it turns a very light baby blue kind of a color, which is some kind of chemical reaction between the Brasso and the tarnish. And I'm just going to take a nylon bristled brush here and I'm just going to begin scrubbing it down. Now, I don't want to make this look completely brand new. I do want a little bit of tarnish left over. Not a lot, but you know, a nice hint of it. So I'm not going too crazy with the scrubbing. Next step is to just put them in some nice hot soapy water. And this is just going to help to remove the residue from the Brasso. And then I'm just going to dry them off. And that's pretty much all I'm doing to this hardware. Again, all I wanted to do was just clean them up and keep a little bit of the patina. And I think they turned out pretty well. They look a little bit more shiny on camera than they do in real life, but there is still a decent amount of the patina left, so I'm happy with this. And I'm just going to put that aside for later. And now to buff off the rest of the piece. This is really going to be a time because especially on those very decorative legs, it's going to be pretty challenging to really buff off all of the oil. And when I say buff off, I mean you have to remove every single last little bit of residue of the oil. If you don't remove all of the oil, it can get kind of sticky after a while. It can look kind of dull. And you can see in this shot right here, it's just a time lapse, how much buffing I actually have to do. The goal is to remove all of the oil so that when you drag your hand across or your fingers across, there are no streaks or oil lines. Until you can drag your fingers across the surface and you don't have any trails or any residue remaining, you have to keep buffing. It's a lot of work, but it's totally worth it in the end. The finish is beautiful. And now to buff off these legs. Oh my goodness. I'm just coming in with the same kind of towel that I'll use to buff off the top of the piece. And I'm just going to buff off everything that I can with this towel. And then for those little nooks and crannies that I can't really reach with the towel, I'm just going to use a Q-tip, a dry Q-tip, and just get as much as I possibly can out of those little nooks and crannies. After letting the top sit for roughly 24 hours or so, I'm going to come in with some Odie's hard wax. I was going to use some Odie's wood butter, but I figured since this is a coffee table and there's going to be a lot of liquid probably spilling on this, some wax would be a really good idea. And this little chunk that I took out right here is going to be able to easily do the entire top, and I might even have some left over. And I'm applying it basically the same way as I apply the oil. I'm just using small circular motions and slowly working it down into the wood grain. And I'm going to let this sit for about 90 minutes until it's time to buff it off. All right, we're almost there. Just got a couple more steps to go. And one thing I totally forgot about was this trim work that went on the top of the piece. First, I just have to take care of this little piece that snapped off. And I'm just going to realign it and make sure that it fits well. And I'm just going to make sure that there's no loose debris or any pieces of wood fibers that are sticking out. And I'm just going to glue it together. Just clamping it up, and I'm going to stick this aside for now and give this the same treatment that I'm about to give all the rest of the trim work. And I tried scraping, but it was kind of weird scraping with the flat blade on a curved surface. Sometimes you can get away with it with a curved surface and a flat blade, but in this case it was just too much of a weird angle and I was actually gouging into it a little bit. So my next tactic to get this finish off is just to sand through it. And immediately I kind of realized that it just wasn't really going to work. It just was taking way too long and not much was coming off. So it's time to grab my butyl gloves and I'm actually going to be stripping this. And I let the stripper sit on the trim work for, I would say, about 10-15 minutes. I really let it sit to really eat away at the finish. And it did soften the finish to a degree, but it was still being very, very stubborn, which doesn't really make much sense because the finish on all the rest of the piece came off with no problem. And for some reason, the finish on this trim work was just not budging. But it did soften it to a degree though, so I'm going to try to sand through it again, and I'm hoping that this time it softened it enough to the point where I could just sand right through it. And I'm using an 80 grit to start off with here, and I'll climb up through my grits up until 220. After sanding to 220, I'm just going to apply that same Odie's oil, wait about an hour and a half, and then I'll buff it off. I decided last minute to actually stain the veneer that I put on. I thought that staining it would give it more of a close color match to the rest of the piece. And of course, it's not going to be a perfect match, but it's in the same family, so I think it's going to look really nice. And plus, I was just trying to get some contrast in a very, very subtle way here. I didn't really want it to pop out at you. I just wanted a nice, subtle kind of difference. And I did that with the wood grain, the direction of the wood grain. So color-wise, it's not really going to stand out too much, but what is going to stand out is the direction of the wood grain. Alright, just a couple more steps. I am now going to screw the tabletop onto the frame, and unfortunately, as I was putting this all together, I realized something that I completely overlooked, and that is the fact that I have to install the trim work back onto the top of the piece, but unfortunately, I already waxed the top, and glue is definitely not going to stick to wax. So now I have to remove some of the Odie's products that I used, and I'm just using some Odie's Safer Solvent, which is going to dissolve the layer of wax and also the layer of Odie's oil that I put on before. And I'm not doing this for the entire top, I'm just doing it for the areas that the trim work would sit. After the Safer Solvent did its thing, I'm just going to come in with a 220 grit sandpaper, and I'm just going to scuff sand around the entire area. And now it's time to adhere the trim. I'm just putting a bead of glue on each surface, and then I'm going to clamp it up. And then after that, I just need to punch new holes into the piece of veneer that I put over the drawer face and on the other side. And then it's just a matter of putting on the hardware and putting some extra Odie's wax on the areas that I took it off. So I just wanted to say thank you guys so much for watching another video. I know this video was a little bit longer, and you guys have been telling me that you wanted longer videos, so I listened. If you guys like this kind of content, consider subscribing. I try to put out a video as often as I can. It usually ends up being probably around 2 weeks or so. I'm getting into the habit now of working on more than one piece at a time. Like right now, I'm actually working on 2 different pieces, this table and another little vanity that you've probably seen in the video. So I'm going to be uploading another video probably in a couple days. Also, if you guys have any suggestions on how I can make these videos any better for you, please let me know in the comments. Also, something I wanted to mention is that I know I haven't really gotten back to anybody in the comments really the past couple of weeks, and that's just because I've been so very busy. During the holidays and because of work. I still have a full-time job actually. I'm working a full-time job, a 9-to-5 job, and then I come home and I work until about midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning on my furniture. So I haven't really had a lot of time to get back to everybody in the comments, but I will definitely, in the next couple of days, I will sit down and respond to comments. So again, I just wanted to say a big thank you to everybody watching. You guys have been so very kind in the comments section and with giving me advice and tips and tricks. So without being all mushy, I just wanted to say a big thank you. But anyway, let's rewind a little bit here and take a look at what this piece used to look like. It was very old looking and kind of falling apart, honestly. The trim work was completely falling off. There were scratches and scuff marks, and the finish was pretty much failing all over the place. And it also had this fluted design on the apron of the piece that I just really didn't think complemented it at all. I really tried my best to bring this piece back to life, and I really hope you guys like it as much as I do now. So back to the question that I asked in the very beginning of this video, is it worth it? Was this piece worth the flip? And I personally think yes, but you guys let me know what you think in the comments. All right, it's about that time. Let's take a look at what this piece is looking like now. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you next time.